And the Monterey Public Library welcomes you to Journey of a Naturalist, presented by Emily Gottlieb. For those who attended the Cannery Row Days program, you'll recognize her as our remarkable moderator for this series. And it is a great joy to welcome and introduce Emily, who is the Education Director with the Western Flyer Foundation. And again, questions will be accepted at the end of the program. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you, Francesca, and thanks so much to the Monterey Public Library for hosting me again. I'm happy to be here, happy to see some familiar faces. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And Francesca, can you see that okay? Awesome. All right, so thanks again, everyone, for being here. As Francesca mentioned, I'm Emily Gottlieb. I'm the Education Director with the Western Flyer Foundation. I'm going to be telling you all about the foundation at the end of my presentation, so stay tuned for the whole thing. So I just want to start you off with this quote that I find really inspiring. It's a Steinbeck quote that comes from the log of the Sea of Cortez. So it asks you to, it says, it is advisable to look from the tide pool to the stars and then back to the tide pool again. So I just want to invite you to take a moment and look around your room, find something that came from nature, and just spend some time looking at it and exploring it. And what do you notice about it? Where do you think it came from, or where do you know that it came from? And how does it make you feel? So just take a minute to do that, kind of ground yourself and think about something that's in your room. So to me, the spirit of a journey is exploration, and it's open-mindedness, and it's wanting to learn more about the world around you and about yourself. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about journeys today. Before I start, I just want to begin with a quick definition of a term that I'll be using. The term is community science. You may be more familiar with the term citizen science, which has been defined as the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. I'm going to be using the term community science to mean the same thing. Community science is more inclusive, and it really better reflects all of the people who participate in this important work. And many organizations that practice community science have transitioned to using this term, and I think that our choice of words is important. So I've been working as a community science program manager for a number of years. I started this work at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where I did my master's. And there I worked for a marine biogeochemical lab, and I developed protocol and curricula for students to study ocean acidification. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, ocean acidification is a chemical process that happens when carbon dioxide is absorbed into seawater. After Scripps, I started working at the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History, where I managed the Limpets program. Limpets is a community science program which was founded by the late, great John Pierce. And through that program, middle school and high school and college students collect data in intertidal ecosystems. So I'm going to pause for another definition here. So what does intertidal mean? So the intertidal is of or denoting the area of a seashore which is covered at high tide and uncovered at low tide. So we're talking here about sandy beaches, tide pools, rocky coastlines, so places along the coast. So it was during my time with the Limpets program and at the PG Museum that I really fell in love with the intertidal. I took this picture on one of my first trips out to the tide pools in Monterey in the spring of 2015. And those of you who knew John Pierce will recognize this quote. So you can see in this picture a Hopkins rose nudibranch. It's that pink kind of Muppet looking thing that's really well camouflaged against some pink coralline algae. That spring in 2015, there was an unusual number of these bright pink nudibranchs in the area. And I just fell in love with all the bright colors in the tide pools, the biodiversity, and the really curious interactions that I got to see every day. I learned so much over the years from my mentor and my friend, John. John was boundlessly curious and generous with his knowledge. Not only did I learn from him the names and the relationships between the creatures in the tide pools, but he also reinforced for me the importance of community science, of getting young people involved in research and really valuing their observations. So I've always been a traveler at heart, and I developed a growing interest in visiting another country to study the intertidal ecology in another area. I really wanted to compare what I'd been observing in Monterey to another system. And I also wanted to expand my ideas about how community science could work in another place. So in 2019, I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright grant to do research in Argentina. So I'm going to start this next section with yet another definition, because I'll be talking a lot about introduced species. So what is an introduced species? An introduced species is a species living outside its native distributional range, but which has arrived there by human activity, directly or indirectly, and either deliberately or accidentally. So you may also sometimes hear the terms alien species, exotic species, immigrant or foreign species used in place of introduced species. But again, I use the term introduced species because I think that our choice of words are very important. So when an introduced species has a detrimental effect on a local ecosystem, we use the term invasive species. But it's never really as simple as that. Even an invasive species can confer positive effects on their ecosystem. So a local example that we have is ice plant. So some of you may be familiar with this plant. It grows in coastal ecosystems. And it's known widely as an invasive species. Here in Monterey, it outcompetes native plants, but it also provides habitat and dune stabilization. So like I said, it's just never really that simple. So these are the places where I did research in Argentina. I decided to study introduced species there. There's this sort of nice symmetry to it because they had taken a journey too. I did research in Mar del Plata, Puerto Madryn, and Ushuaia. So those were my 3 research sites. In Puerto Madryn, I studied an introduced green crab. In that town, there had been a recent massive die-off of a native mussel species, and we wanted to see if crab predation could account for that die-off. So it turns out that the crabs can eat a huge amount of mussels in a short period of time, so they might be at least in part responsible for the die-off of mussels. So I've got a little video to show you here. I can get that to play. So this is just an experiment that we ran. We put these introduced crabs into a tank with mussels, and we weighed how much biomass they could eat over a certain period of time. But the story that I really want to tell you about is about an introduced species that has a very positive effect on its environment in Argentina. So you may recognize in this photo common acorn barnacles. So they are a native species of barnacle along the West Coast. So we have them here in Monterey and all along the coast of California. But they are an introduced species in Argentina. Barnacles are arthropods. They're related to shrimp. And after a planktonic larval stage, when they're floating around in the ocean, they cement themselves to rocks and they filter feed with their feet. So next to the barnacles, which are white in this picture, you'll see little black limpets. Limpets are gastropods. They're related to snails. They eat algae and they tend to sort of hunker down and they stay still during low tide and they wait for the tide to come back up. So my colleagues in Argentina had noticed a really interesting pattern. They noticed that in areas where the introduced barnacles had settled, they would find more limpets during low tide. So we wanted to find out exactly what was driving this positive relationship between the barnacles and the limpets. So we conducted a few experiments. So here on the picture on the right, you can see one experiment where we were looking at the physical structure of the barnacle. So we removed barnacles from certain areas and we replaced them with mimic barnacles that were made out of epoxy to see if the limpets would return. The limpets did in fact return, which implies that the structure of the barnacle has some sort of positive physical effect for the limpets. So it might be that they provide shade or temperature control during low tide. But that's not the whole story. We also wanted to see whether the presence of the barnacles had some sort of positive biological effect on the environment for the limpets. So we conducted another experiment, and it turns out that more algae grows in areas where barnacles are present. So this further helps to explain the presence of limpets near barnacles, because remember, limpets feed on algae. So I've always used visual art to help understand and explain scientific concepts. And I recently presented the results of our experiment at a conference, and I made this video to help explain the relationship between the barnacles and the limpets. Oops, there we go. So in that animation, you could see a pretty simplified version of this story. So as the barnacles settle in an area, more algae grows, and then the limpets come to that area around the barnacles to graze, thereby reducing the amount of algae. So while in Argentina, in addition to this ecological research, I was also interested in studying community science. So I worked with the researchers there to implement a few programs that engage young people and volunteers in conservation research. So in this program, or in this photo here, you can see one program, which is a microplastic monitoring program. Microplastics are very small bits of plastic that can be found floating in the water and washed up on the sand and in sediments. And microplastics are a huge problem in marine environments. And one step in tackling that problem is first knowing where they're found. So this microplastic monitoring program was first developed in the United Kingdom, and it uses really simple protocol. So basically anyone from kids to adults can participate in this research and help to quantify microplastics. So these are my one of my friend's kids sifting through the sand to look for microplastics. So I also worked with the researchers there to set up an intertidal monitoring program, really similar to the limpets program that we have here in California. So during my journey in Argentina, I was led to learn about yet another journey that had happened almost 80 years earlier. I found out that the Western Flyer Foundation was restoring the historic Western Flyer vessel, and I immediately picked up a copy of the log from the Sea of Cortez. So here's an old photo of the Western Flyer. So in 1940, Ed Ricketts, who was an intertidal biologist based in Monterey, decided that he wanted to go on an expedition to the Sea of Cortez to catalog intertidal species along the coast. And he invited his best friend, the writer John Steinbeck, to come along. They assembled a crew and found an old fishing boat, the Western Flyer. So just as I used visual art to explain science, Steinbeck used his craft, writing, to explain this incredible scientific expedition. So the result of this journey was the book, The Sea of Cortez, which was later republished as the log from the Sea of Cortez. In reading the log from the Sea of Cortez, I was struck by the fact that Ed Ricketts was really practicing community science long before we had a term for it. His crew members, including Steinbeck, were all untrained. None of them were scientists, but they collected and they helped to identify specimens, and they contributed to research in a meaningful way. And they also engaged with local community members and got them involved in the research. So I'd like to read a passage from the book. See if I can pull this up. The tide was running out, and the low shore east of the town was beginning to show through the shallow water. We gathered our paraphernalia and started for the beach, expecting and finding a fauna new to us. Here on the flats, the water is warm, very warm, and there's no wave shock. It would be strange indeed if, with few exceptions of ubiquitous animals, there should not be a definite change. The base of this flat was of rubble, in which many knobs and limbs of old coral were embedded, making an easy hiding place for burrowing animals. In rubber boots, we moved over the flat uncovered by the dropping tide. A silty sand made the water obscure when a rock or a piece of coral was turned over. And as always, when one is collecting, we were soon joined by a number of small boys. The very posture of search, the slow movement with the head down, seems to draw people. "What did you lose?" they ask. "Nothing." "Then what do you search for?" And this is an embarrassing question. We search for something that will seem like the truth to us. We search for understanding. We search for that principle which keys us deeply into the pattern of all life. We search for the relations of things, one to another, as this young man searches for a warm light in his wife's eyes, and that one for the hot warmth of fighting. These little boys and young men on the tide flat do not even know that they search for such things too. We say to them, "We are looking for curios, for small animals." And then the little boys help us to search. They are ragged and dark, and each one carries a small iron harpoon. It is the toy of La Paz, owned and treasured as tops or marbles are in America. They poke about the rocks with their little harpoons, and now and then a lazing fish which blunders too close feels the bite of the iron. There's a small ghost shrimp which lives on these flats, an efficient little fellow who lives in a burrow. He moves very rapidly and is armed with claws which can pinch painfully. He retires backward into his hole so that to come at him from above is to invite his weapons. The little boys solved the problem for us. We offered 10 centavos for each one they took. They dug into the rubble and old coral until they got behind the ghost shrimp in his burrow. Then, prodding, they drove him, outraged, from his hole. Then they banged him good to reduce his pinching power. We refused to buy the banged up ones. They had to get us lively ones. Small boys are the best collectors in the world. They soon worked out a technique for catching the shrimps with only an occasional pinched finger. And then the 10 centavo pieces began running out, and an increasing cloud of little boys brought us specimens. Small boys have such sharp eyes, and they are quick to notice deviation. Once they know you are generally curious, they bring amazing things. Perhaps we only practice an extension of their urge. It is easy to remember when we were small and lay on our stomachs beside a tide pool, and our minds and eyes went so deeply into it that the size and identity were lost. And the creeping hermit crab was our size, and the tiny octopus a monster. Then the waving algae covered us, and we hid under a rock at the bottom and leapt out at fish. It is very possible that we, and even those who probe space with equations, simply extend this wonder. So what Steinbeck is describing here really gets to the heart of community science. Community scientists learn as they're participating in the research, just as the young boys do in this text, but they're also teaching the researchers as they go. They're making new observations, they innovate, and they inspire wonder. So community science is really a two-way street. So that brings us to the present. I'm back in Monterey and working as the education director of the Western Flyer Foundation. The mission of the foundation is to stir curiosity by connecting art and science in the spirit of John Steinbeck, Ed Ricketts, and their journey on the Western Flyer. The Western Flyer vessel is currently being restored up in Port Townsend, Washington. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check out the Western Flyer Foundation YouTube channel to see some amazing videos produced by our project director, Chris Chase, all about the restoration of the boat. Next year, the boat will be back in Monterey, and it will be equipped with scientific instruments, and it will be a tool for the Western Flyer Foundation to deeply engage with the communities that it visits. As the boat retraces the journey to the Sea of Cortez, students, researchers, artists, writers, all community members will have access to the boat, and educational programs will guide scientific research and artistic inspiration. So we've already gotten started with some of this educational work. In the time of COVID, we've been developing educational resources for distance learning. One program is a scientific illustration mentorship program. K through 12 classes are paired with professional science illustrators, and the students learn about new techniques and career paths. And we've also developed curriculum materials for middle school that merge science and humanities. The first module is all about physics and the history of the Western Flyer, and the next module will be about evolution and the journey to the Sea of Cortez. So if you have a teacher in your life, please send them my way. I have some resources for them. So I'll leave you again with this beautiful quote from the book to reflect on. And I'll just remind you that you don't have to go to Argentina or to the Sea of Cortez to make a profound journey. You can journey by observing your own backyard or reflecting on your community. A journey of any kind can connect us to new places and ideas, and a journey can also connect us more deeply to ourselves and to our own homes. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'd love to open it up to questions or discussion. So yeah. And folks can feel free to unmute themselves if they'd like to.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Would you say that the limpet and the barnacle have a symbiotic relationship?
That's a good question. I don't think it's necessarily symbiotic. I think the limpet is benefiting, and the barnacle seems to have no effect on the barnacle. So yeah, it's not exactly symbiosis. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. One way to describe what the barnacles are doing there is ecosystem engineering. So they're ecosystem engineers in that area. They're changing the ecosystem and making it more favorable for the limpets to live there.
We need that.
Yeah, exactly. Greg, yeah, hi.
Emily, that was a nice story, and I think John would have loved to have heard it. Makes me sad. I'm curious about the algae. It looked like in your diagram, the algae seems to come in the case of your diagram, to the southwest of the barnacle. Is it to do with sunlight, or does it have to do with water circulation, nutrients, or what? It seemed like there was a pattern, or maybe that was just the diagram.
That was just the diagram. That's a really good question. We did do one experiment though, actually, where we looked at which side of the barnacles the limpets settle on. And interestingly enough, they tend to settle on the south side of the barnacles. So it seems to be that the limpets are kind of settling in the shadier side of the barnacles. So that sort of points to the idea that it might be shade or temperature control that the barnacles are conferring for the limpets.
So you know, if you have a sailboat and you have it in the harbor, you know that the south side has faster algal growth, and if you let it go too long, faster barnacle growth too. I'm wondering if it has to do with sunlight.
That is really interesting. Yeah, I wonder that as well.
So I have a question. What is the difference? How would you define the difference between citizen science and community science?
There's no difference in my mind. It's just a different term. I think that the transition from the term citizen to community science started, a few years ago when the term citizen had a lot of political underpinnings to it. And the idea is that anybody can participate in community science. Citizenship has nothing to do with it. If you're a member of the community, then you can participate. So I think they're one and the same. Although there is another use of the term community science in ecology, so that it sometimes gets confused with that. But for the sake of describing participatory science, that's what I mean.
Okay.
That's a good question. Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because there's just a book by Mary Ellen Hannibal, Citizen Science, published a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I think you'll still really commonly hear citizen science used to mean the same thing. So they're sort of interchangeable.
Okay.
Lee, hi.
Hi, thanks, and that was very interesting. You mentioned that acorn barnacles were introduced, an introduced species down in Argentina, and so I'm imagining they came down on a boat, but is there by chance some different way that they were introduced down there?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I don't know exactly. My assumption is that they came either on a boat or in ballast water, but there are records of them going back to like the middle of the past century. So they've been there for a really long time, and I don't think anybody really knows exactly where they came from, but I think it was an unintentional introduction. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Bob.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering where locally can we go to see the interaction between the barnacles and the limpets that you described having seen in Argentina? Is there some place, in the Monterey Bay area where we might observe that?
That is such a good question. One of the amazing things about the Monterey Bay area is that it's incredibly biodiverse. So the systems that I was studying in Argentina were really simple. There was, in the high intertidal where I found the barnacles, there were limpets, and there was maybe one or two type of algae. And if you go to the high intertidal in Monterey, you'll find a few different types of barnacles. You'll find almost a dozen different species of limpets, all sorts of different types of algae. So the system is a lot more complicated. But I would say that if you're interested in looking at the high intertidal, you can go to a number of places. You can go to right in front of the Point Pinos Lighthouse is a nice place to go. The Great Tide Pool, of course, which is just kind of in between there and Asilomar Beach, is also a nice place to go. Carmel Point is one of my favorite places to go tide pooling. Where else? Definitely, if you have the chance to go up to Santa Cruz to Natural Bridges, that's an incredible site, or Point Lobos, really, really cool stuff. And each of those spots is very different. But I think what you'll find if you look at the barnacles, or look at the area in the high intertidal, it's crowded with so many barnacles and so many limpets that particular pattern that I saw in Argentina isn't necessarily true here. There's just a lot more stuff going on.
So we might see barnacles and you might see limpets, but we might not see them in close proximity as you did in Argentina.
Yeah, or it might be that there's just such a completely crowded area with so many barnacles and so many different things there that it would be hard to say that it's the barnacles presence that draws the limpets there, as opposed to something else like algae or other things that might be there. Yeah.
I mean, it would be nice to explain to people who are from out of our area, visitors from the Midwest or something, and show them this and say, well, here's the relationship between the barnacle and the algae and then the limpets. And but yeah, no one particular place where we could actually, do that little bit of education.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's definitely just, there are other things that are really amazing to observe in Monterey, and other patterns that are great, but this particular pattern I think was specific to this area. And I think it's interesting to think about this, right? Like in Argentina and the coastline where I was studying, it's the major physical stressors are high wind, and so it gets really, really dry there very quickly as soon as the tide goes down. So you can imagine before there were barnacles there in the high intertidal, there was really no shelter or no place for these limpets to sort of hide out during low tide. So it may have been that they settled lower, closer to the water, or they might have found, cracks or crevices to settle in. But with the barnacles present there, all of a sudden there's this whole new zone that's opened up to them. They're able to settle up higher. There's food available up higher for them. So it's kind of neat to think about in that way too.
So it's a good evolutionary kind of explanation for what you observed.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thanks for your question, Bob.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Any other questions? Or we can open it up. We can talk more about tide pools or community science or anything. Yeah, go ahead, Ruth. I think you're still muted.
You mentioned the microplastic problem. Is there a way that you have reached out to schools as far as having a project like that?
Yeah, I haven't started to spread that idea yet in Monterey, but that microplastic monitoring program is worldwide already. So it's actually called the Microplastic Monitoring Project, I believe. You can Google it. And as I mentioned in the presentation, it was started in the United Kingdom. They do it, I know that they have sites down in Chile where they monitor, now in Argentina, all over Europe. And there are certainly sites in the US where they're monitoring too. But I would love to start a program like that in our area as well. I think it would be really neat to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's a really fun protocol. You just make a little quadrat out of a rope, and then you take little kind of cookie cutters and you sift through the sand and count the number of microplastic particles you find there. So.
I taught in elementary schools, and that's something the kids could really eat up. It's simple and fun, and it's contributing to the environment.
Absolutely, yeah, it's really, really important research. So yeah, I think it would be awesome for elementary school students to do. Where did you teach?
Well, I'm retired now, but I taught for 39 years in Monterey Unified School District.
Oh, nice.
3 different schools, and now I'm a guide for the Monterey State Historic Park. I can't seem to retire.
It's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you know any current teachers who might be interested in, in microplastic monitoring or any of the other, like the education programs that I mentioned that we're doing, feel free to, I can put my email into the chat box. You can definitely put them in touch with me.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Hello.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi, I'm watching this from the East Coast.
Oh,
welcome.
And thinking about a wonderful experience I had on Isle of Howe in Maine, just looking at barnacles, and now listening to you talk. I hope I'm able to go back there and look at them in a different way. And I think that the microplastic is very important for youth to start understanding the need to explore how we can get them out of our systems of ecology. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that you get back to the coast in Maine to watch the barnacles. That's wonderful.
Yes.
Well, thanks for tuning in. I know it's a little bit later on the East Coast, but I'm glad that you're with us. That's pretty cool.
Oh, well, it's not that late, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So Emily, are they continuing the work after you've left?
The community science programs are still going on. Most of the schools have been, shut down just like they have been here, but those are going on. The barnacle research, I'm not sure what's happening with that right now, but that video the quick video with the green crabs, I know that research project is still going on. They're still kind of trying to tease out all of the factors that might have gone into the mussel die-off that happened in Puerto Madryn. So they're still working on that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. It's sort of unknown what caused the die-off, and it was really, really quickly happened over one season that there were just these huge patches of mussels. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with the intertidal, mussel beds are one of the most common species, or mussels are one of the most common types of animals. So in most intertidal ecosystems, they're found kind of in the mid-tide zone, so the area that's sort of at the zero tide line. And mussels provide really critical habitat for other invertebrates. So they provide little shelter and places for animals to hide and to hunt. And then they're also substrate for algae to grow. So mussels are really, really important to the biodiversity of an intertidal ecosystem. So when mussel beds die off, it's a big cause for concern in terms of loss of biodiversity. So that's why they're investigating it.
And are they investigating the connections between the barnacles and limpets and the mussels?
I don't know that there's been any specific research done there. The barnacles are found quite a bit higher up in the intertidal than the mussel beds are. So I don't think that there's any direct interaction there that they're looking at. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Emily, at the aquarium, we talk with guests about biomimicry, borrowing things from nature and whatnot. And one thing we talk about is barnacle glue, cement, if you will, how it can work in water and bind things so tightly. Did your research at all go into the cement, the glue part of barnacles? And can you share anything with us about that?
No, that's such a cool example of biomimicry to use. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, they designed the braces glue after barnacle glue, the stuff that they use to stick braces to teeth. I don't know much about it. I think it's really interesting. The extent that I know about it is it was really hard to get the mimic barnacles that we made to stick. It was hard to get them to stick to the rocks. So it was epoxy, so it was kind of these epoxy clay that we would roll together, and then we had to dry off the rocks and clean it off and stick it on. But we had almost a 50% loss rate of these mimic barnacles. So it just speaks to how incredible the barnacle's natural adhesive must have been to be able to stick and withstand all the pounding waves. But that's neat. I'd be curious to know kind of what you know about the adhesive.
Nothing really. Just that we talk with guests about that being an example of the kind of thing that if we could reproduce that and do it as effectively as barnacles could, you'd have a real product on your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be $1 million idea if you could get that going. It's pretty incredible. Yeah, it was quite that. So for that part of the research project, we had to scrape the barnacles off the rock first in very small areas, so that we would put the mimic barnacles in spots where other barnacles had been. And it was really hard to scrape them off. It was just I would come out of the tide pool with bloody knuckles just from trying to use this paint scraper to get them off the rocks. It takes a lot of effort. They're really incredible creatures.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I'd be curious just to see how many folks who are here on the call are from are calling in from like the Monterey area.
How many? Oh, yeah.
Quite a few of you. Okay. And then how many from outside of the Monterey area, including the East Coast?
I'm from the East Coast.
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, cool. How did you find out about the program?
I'm a subscriber to the Monterey County Weekly, and I saw a little post, and I'm originally from California, transplanted to Boston, and so I visit family, and I like to keep up with California events, and I saw this, and I'm going to be looking for more.
Nice. That's awesome.
Thank you, Monterey Library.
Yeah,
Yeah, I second that. Thank you. They've been putting on incredible programs this year.
they do.
Yeah. Well, I hope that those of you who are in the Monterey area are looking forward to the return of the Western Flyer. It's going to be really exciting next year to have that boat in town. So yeah, it'll be neat. We'll have to have a big party when it arrives.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anyway, along those lines, has any progress been made on having a little site for the Western Flyer to have a mini museum down by the Coast Guard Pier? Or do you know about that?
Ooh, I don't actually know anything about that. I'm not sure. Susan, do you want to speak to that at all?
Well, the Western Flyer, when it comes back to Monterey and other communities along the West Coast, there will be a larger presence here because it will be here a large part of the year. So specifically, there's no concrete location decided for a museum, but there's hopes that there will be one somewhere. I mean, everything basically got put on hold because of COVID. But I urge everybody to look at the Western Flyer YouTube channel and look at the progress of the boat on the YouTube channel. And the latest one was about restoring a bus to take students from the, say, Central Valley, or not the Central Valley, but certainly from Salinas and San Benito County to the Monterey Peninsula. So it's a great video. So. But that's all I know so far.
Classic flexible buses.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good video. So I guess my answer is wait and see.
To be determined. Well, I guess if there are no other questions, I mean, we could end a little early too. But if anyone has any thoughts or questions about the Western Flyer or anything else, Susan and I can try and field them as best we can.
Okay.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm gonna throw my email into the chat. Oh, do I have?
Emily, no, actually, what I'll do is I'll email everyone after your email address.
Okay, great.
And of course, the Monterey Public Library thanks you so much for your time today and sharing this really fascinating adventure and science, and encouraging us to learn more and explore our surroundings. So thank you so much, and I'm so excited for the Western Flyer to return here. And won't it be exciting that we've met virtually and then we'll all be able to meet in person one day and know that we met here. So thank you, of course, to everyone who joined as well. The email will include a brief survey, and it will also have a link if you'd like to subscribe to the library's e-blasts, which come out about once or twice a month, and that will have upcoming programs. So we would love to continue seeing you. It also has space for you to suggest any programs that you'd like to see take place as well. So again, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to everyone who attended today to participate in today's program.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Jessica.
everybody.
Thank you.
Do well, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.
You too.
Very good job. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.